So Chris Schuler is a writer, journalist, editor and historian, and he's also an active volunteer with the London Wildlife Evening based on his most recent book about the Great North Wood. I know we're all looking forward to learning more about this really fascinating topic, which a lot of people are not particularly familiar with. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I'm going to hand over to you, Chris.
Hello. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. As Maria just mentioned, I have been volunteering with the London Wildlife Trust at their reserve at Sydenham Hill since 2011. And I hadn't been volunteering very long before I learnt that it was actually an ancient woodland, a surviving fragment, indeed, of a wood that once covered a great swathe of South London, stretching 7 miles from Deptford to just north of Croydon. This fascinated me. There are other surviving fragments, particularly around Beulah Hill in Norwood. But I started looking for old maps that showed its former extent. Now, I'm going to share a screen and here we go. Next one. This is an extract from OpenStreetMap, which is a copyright-free online source that you may well be aware of already. What I've done is superimposed onto it the former extent of the woodland, and I'll show you how it works out. And there we go. Right up in the north, you've got Hatcham Wood, which is in the vicinity of New Cross, and one of the first bits to disappear. I mean, this basically shows the extent of the woodland between about 1600 and 1800. Below that, you've got Honor Oak Wood, which is in the suburb of Honor Oak, and where One Tree Hill is a surviving fragment of that. Here we have the Dulwich Woods. To the right of it, Sydenham Common. Now, to the south, you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury's woods, which stretch all the way down through the parish of Croydon. Now, the reason these woods survived as long as they did was that they crown a clay ridge, which stretches pretty much for the extent of the wood before dropping precipitously towards Croydon. And it does form the highest point between the North Downs and Hampstead. Now, which is why there are two transmitters on the top of it at Crystal Palace and at Norwood. Now, the steepness of the ground made it unsuitable for arable or pasture. So while much of the surrounding lowlands was cleared very early on, the woods themselves were allowed to remain because for many centuries, the most economical way of using such steep ground was for woodland management and the harvesting of woodland produce. This was done by a system known as coppicing, whereby a tree is cut just above ground level and then allowed to send out shoots. Each area of coppice trees was also known as a coppice, and they were usually left for about 10 years to regrow and were felled in rotation. Now, for much of history, most of the woods were ecclesiastical property. The northern parts of the wood in the parishes of Camberwell and Lewisham belonged to Bermondsey Abbey after the dissolution of the monasteries, the manor of Dulwich was sold to a London goldsmith called Thomas Courton. And in the early 17th century, his grandson, Francis Courton, sold it to the actor impresario Edward Alleyne, who founded Dulwich College there, and used the produce of the woods to fund his charitable school. To the south, the woods belonged to, or fell within the manor of Croydon, which had, since before the Norman conquest, been a property of the Archbishops of Canterbury. Hence, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury's woods. Now, both Alleyne and the archbishops operated a system of rotational coppicing. In fact, they each divided their woods into 10 coppices, one of which would be felled each year, usually in winter between November and February when the sap was in the ground. So they were not removing the biomass from the trees. What you then get is a highly developed root system capable of sustaining a mature tree that's got nothing to do but send out new shoots. And these poles were then harvested every 10 years and used for all manner of implements and objects, chair and table legs, tool handles, wheel spokes, axles. The smaller ones were quite often split lengthways and used to make hurdles, which could be used to pen animals, and also as infill in timber frame buildings, which would then be plastered over. So as you can imagine, there was considerable economic value to be extracted from the woods. The coppice wood was also used to make charcoal, and all around Croydon there were charcoal kilns in the woods right up until the end of the 18th century. It was very well known for charcoal, and as early as the 14th century, 3 or 4 charcoal sellers from Croydon were put in the stocks in the City of London for selling short measure. So that gives you an idea of roughly how long that trade had been going on. What then happens is that this system of rotational harvesting creates a great mixture of habitats. It's not actually hostile to nature at all, because the coppice poles growing densely from the stem provide refuge for insects, which in turn provide food for birds. And it also, a coppice tree can live 3 times as long as it would do in its natural state. The woods were composed mostly of oak, particularly sessile oak, which tends to grow on higher grounds than the pedunculate oak, and mixed in with hornbeam and various other trees, yew, holly, rowan, wild cherry, and so on, which is pretty much the mix that you find in the surviving fragments today. We are very fortunate in that we have evidence of the antiquity of these woods from both an ecological standpoint and in the documentary record. There are plenty of ancient indicators growing in the woods, particularly wood anemone, English bluebell, although that is sort of somewhat compromised by hybridization with garden escapees, lily of the valley, and numerous other plants. There are also a number of saproxylic insects that only exist in well-established woodland, most famously the stag beetle, which will probably be out and about right about now. Also, because the 2 main portions of the wood were owned by the Dulwich estate and the Archbishopric of Canterbury, respectively, means that we have a documentary record of them, because obviously both these institutions are still functioning, and they do have well-kept archives. I spent a lot of time in the Dulwich College archives and in Lambeth Palace Library, looking at historical records of the woodland management, and you can actually tell which coppice was felled in each year throughout, certainly in the case of Dulwich, throughout most of the 17th century. The rights to coppice, to fell a coppice, were sold usually to local farmers, and they were then responsible for removing the timber as well, and giving account of it to the college. And these records tell you which coppice was felled in which year, who the rights were sold to, and how much money it raised. And it was very clearly, we're talking about sort of in pounds, double figures in the 17th century. That's quite a lot of money. During the Civil War, and the interregnum that followed, the rights were sold almost exclusively to city merchants, who were the bedrock of support for the parliamentarians. But after the Restoration, it went back to being local yeoman farmers. Now, one point I should mention is that Oliver Rackham has pointed out that ancient woodland tends to survive on the boundaries of parishes. Now, these woods straddle 2 counties, Surrey and Kent, and 5 parishes: Camberwell, Lambeth, Beckenham, Croydon, and rather oddly, Battersea, because Penge, which you can see here, sort of kind of the hamlet of Penge was an outlying property of the manor of Battersea, and had been since it was granted to Battersea by one of the later Saxon kings. Now, I'm going to move on to the next map. This shows the extent of the woods in the mid-18th century. This is from John Rock's The Country Nearly 10 Miles Around London, which was published in 1746. And this is just the relevant portion of it, obviously. It's an immensely valuable map for local historians all over Greater London. And here you can see you've got Oak of Honor Wood, which he calls Oak of Arnon up the top there. And then here you've got Northwood spelt right throughout there. Now, I discovered early in my research, rather embarrassingly, that there is no historical record for the name Great Northwood before the late 19th century, when it was already rapidly disappearing. It seems to have been applied retrospectively. Throughout history, it was known as the Northwood or Norwood because it lay to the north of Croydon. As you can see, Sydenham Common is also known as Westwood Common because that, in the Middle Ages, was a property of Lewisham Priory, so it lay to the west of there. So these names are simply broadly geographical. What then happens to the woods is down basically to the Industrial Revolution and the Enclosure Acts. The Industrial Revolution did away with the need for many woodland produce, things that would have been made out of coppice wood were now mass produced out of iron and steel, and charcoal was replaced by coal as the canals facilitated the transport of coal from the north of England. So by this, I'm going to move on to the next map. This is Thomas Milne's land use map, again covering the whole of London, but once again we've just got the relevant section. This was surveyed in the 1790s, and you can see how at the top the Oak of Honor wood is already being chopped up, and in the middle fields have cut right through the woods down to Penge, from Dulwich to Penge. Now this is just the beginning of the process. Between about 1780 and 1820, the commons that surrounded, that bordered the woods, Sydenham Common, Dulwich Common, Norwood Common, which were semi-wooded and provided an extension of the wood and a buffer zone. They were enclosed. Basically, they were sold to the highest bidder, initially for farming, to be rented out as farmland, and then subsequently, as the 19th century progressed, for development. Now, Milne has coloured his map to show the land use, and you will notice the predominance of pink all around here. This is, and they're also marked P. These are parks and paddocks. So you can see that already what was fundamentally a rural area is now being given over to sort of residential and leisure use. This is partly due to the construction of Blackfriars Bridge in the 1760s, which meant that city merchants who could afford to run a coach and horses could quite easily commute to the area, and several large Georgian villas still exist from that period. This then, of course, with the coming of the railways, the process of suburbanization is rapidly sped up, and large portions of the wood disappear, leaving just the fragments that we have today. As far as the botany of the woods is concerned, we only start getting records in, well, as you probably might expect, in the 18th century, following the formation of the Royal Society in the 1660s, and the growth of, largely amateur zoological and botanical groups. Certainly one of the earliest was the Aurelian Society. They were entomologists who, unfortunately, the pub in Cornhill where they used to meet burned down, and they narrowly escaped with their lives and lost all their specimens and notes. But Moses Harrison, the nephew of one of its founders, who was also called Moses Harrison, revived it a few years later and published a magnificent book called The Aurelian, which does contain sightings of insects within the area of the North Wood. The other sort of source of early records, particularly botanical records, is William Curtis's monumental Flora Londiniensis, which was published in installments towards the end of the 18th century. And he notes several species of St. John's wort, Hypericum, Androsemum, Hirsutum, and Pulchrum, hoary ragwort in oak of, which was nowhere more abundant than the oak of honor wood, which of course we have here. He also notes Lathyrus sylvestris and Stachys arvensis in the surrounding cornfields, notes lily of the valley, Convallaria majalis in Dulwich Wood, and the hyacinth, the English hyacinth. And interestingly enough, he actually notes that hybridization with the Spanish bluebell is already taking place in the late 18th century. So maybe it's not as bad as we fear it might be, since the English bluebell is far from extinct. There's a particularly delightful record of a fungus. Of course, in those days, they believed fungi were plants. In the month of November 1780, I fortunately found a fine specimen of this Boletus in the wood adjoining the Oak of Honour near Peckham. This is Boletus lucidus, which is also known as Lingsey. On first discovering it, the top of the pileus and stalk were of so bright a colour and so beautifully polished that I scarcely knew whether I had found a natural or an artificial production. A view of its underside, however, soon convinced me it was natural. It grew out of a rotten hazel stub. I really like that little inscription. But of course, what we have to bear in mind is that these observations from the 18th and the early 19th century, however valuable they are in identifying plants that we still know can be found around the woods, are not systematic or by any modern standard. Most of these writers had a network of correspondents who would simply report sightings that they had made just on their walks. So it's opportunistic, it's not systematic, it's not like a modern transect, which is, you know, conducted along a fixed route at regular intervals so that the data is comparable. But it's still better than nothing, and it's delightful to have these records. A more recent example, study of Dulwich Wood, which I should mention because it actually appeared in the London Naturalist. Edward Lousley conducted a survey of Dulwich and Sydenham Woods in the late 50s, shortly after the railway line that had been driven through Sydenham Hill Wood in the 1860s had closed. I think it shut in 1954. He went there in both 58 and again in 59. In fact, in 59, he explored some other outlying parts of the wood and published a botanical record of what he found there, including, again, Hypericum, Androsemum, and they correspond with both the historic records from people like Curtis and what we know is in the woods today. He noted a considerable quantity of greater horsetail, which we can still find there, although not. There's actually less of it now, even than when I started volunteering 11 years ago. So I think it's somewhat being crowded out by the bramble. But still, it's interesting to know that, you know, some plants are very, very well established in the existing parts of the wood. Now, since 2017, the London Wildlife Trust has been running a Great North Wood project. This was originally funded with Heritage Lottery money, and it was due to come to an end in 2021, I believe, but then they got some more from the Green Recovery Fund, and it only ended this March, just 3 months ago. What they have done is brought all the surviving fragments of the Great North Wood right down to Long Lane Wood, and under a unified management plan, removing invasive species, particularly cherry laurel, which is extremely problematic, and also they've also erected information boards throughout, showing the extent of the wood as a whole and where each site fits into it, and also separate boards detailing what there is in each site with a little map. Now, although the project has now come to an end, they have published a management plan for councils and local friends groups to ensure that the holistic management of all the surviving fragments of the wood will continue into the future. Now let's have a look, see what else there is. Documentary records, yes. Before we had maps, we did have written records, particularly perambulations. This little book I found in the Lambeth Palace Library. It's covered in vellum and about the size of a school exercise book. It's about that big, in fact. And you see it says woods in Kent, and underneath it says, and also in Norwood. That's been written in by hand. Most of the book is about woods in Kent, including Bleanwood near Canterbury. But the very last page is, whoops, I've gone too far. Yeah, very last page is devoted to coppices belonging to the Archbishop of Canterbury lying in Norwood and thereabouts. And here he lists the Archbishop's coppices. There's Wickwood Coppice, Stake Pit Great Coppice and Stake Pit Little Coppice, Claylands Coppice, Elderhole Coppice, etc., etc. This is dating from 1611. Now, skip forward more than half a century, and we do actually have a map. Now, this is the original of this map is in Croydon Museum. It's drawn on a large, long sheet of vellum. It was created by a London mapmaker called William Marr on the commission of the Archbishop's woodreeve, i.e. the manager of his woods. He's identified only by his initials, I or JT. But this was for presentation to the newly appointed Archbishop, William Sancroft, who, became Archbishop that year, 1678. Now, this is a bit confusing by modern standards because south is at the top and north is at the bottom. In fact, it's slightly angled as well, but it's actually beautifully drawn and very well illustrated. I must stress this is my own copy because the original is a rather creased and buckled sheet of vellum, which has clearly seen a lot of use in the fields. And it would have been prohibitively expensive to digitize. So basically, I photographed it with my mobile phone and then stitched all of the photos together and then traced them in Photoshop. But here you can see the coppices that are mentioned in this little booklet. Here you've got Great Stake Pit Coppice, Little Stake Pit Coppice, Gravelly Hill Coppice, Big Inn Hill Coppice, Bewley Coppice, Windles Coppice. Now, to the north, you've got Walter St. John's Woods outside of the Archbishop's Woods. Now, Walter St. John was the lord of the manor of Battersea, so this is Penge. Down here at the bottom, just right by the edge, it mentions Dulwich Common. So that's bordering on these woods to the north. And here, you have this big tree, the Vicar's Oak, which marked the meeting point of the 5 parishes I mentioned earlier, featured in the beating of the bounds by the parishioners of each parish. And during the late 16th century, there was a boundary dispute. The owner of the tenant at that point of the manor of Battersea had felled a coppice that the Archbishop's woodman thought was on the Croydon side of the boundary and confiscated the wood. And there was a legal dispute that dragged on for a decade. The Vicar's Oak features very prominently in the witness statements, the depositions given in evidence. Several local people said it could be seen from 10 or 12 miles away. And one old boy said that he'd seen it from Harrow on the Hill, which is 17 miles as the crow flies. This was sadly felled in the late 17th century to great local outrage, but it was a huge landmark, and its position is commemorated here, the southern gates of Crystal Palace Park. Recently, the council has put in this stump to mark where it stood, although I think if it could be seen from 10 miles away, it must have been a considerably larger tree than that. So we do have these landmarks, and the wood has shaped the local topography, even where it has disappeared. And apart from providing sort of green space for Londoners in, the very busy parts of very densely populated parts of South London, it's also ensured the survival of various species. We have particularly numerous birds. I myself have seen kestrels just a couple of weeks ago who nest in the church spire near Dulwich Woods. Buzzards are a fairly common sight. We've had a tawny owl roosting in the woods. Sparrowhawks, not uncommon. In the winter, we tend to get firecrests and goldcrests, nuthatch, tree creeper, great spotted and green woodpecker. Pretty much, pretty impressive range of birds, which I don't think you would find without, the density of woodland cover, and not just the density of woodland cover, but also the mix. The fact that there are open glades and areas of bushes as well as full height trees. I think we can probably open that up to questions now. I should point out that the book, which is a sort of chronological account of the woods from earliest times to today, is published by Sandstone Press. The paperback is £12.99, but there is a discount for London Natural History Society members and anyone watching tonight. If you give that, you'll get 20% off, which brings it down to about a tenner. Yeah. Okay. Any questions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the offer of the discount. That's really great, and it certainly sounds like it's well worth reading. I found that fascinating. I love maps, and so it was kind of really interesting just to see the sort of changes over time with that kind of range of maps, and how great that you kind of had a documentary source that they're matched so beautifully to the map, so you could actually see the locations of that coppicing. And was that a record of actually the sort of management of the site? Was that recording? Because you talked about being able to track which areas were coppiced when. So was that one of the bits of evidence that helped with that?
Very much so. Yes. I mean, both the Dulwich Estate and the Archbishopric kept bills of sale, which recorded the selling of the rights to coppice the woods, and there are also other notes. There is in the Dulwich Estate there is the surveyor's book from the late 18th, early 19th century, in which he basically records the work that he did. There is a diary from a woodman in the late 17th century in which he sort of basically records his day-to-day work. We also rather wonderfully have what is in effect a job description for the Archbishop of Canterbury's wood reeve. As I said, that's the manager of his wood. This was given by Archbishop William Wake in 1715 to his wood reeve William Stobbs. The wood reeve must be one that well understands the nature of wood and woodlands to order the felling, cutting out, making up, stripping, setting, runting, coaling, racking, etc., to provide workmen, colliers, etc., and to apportion every man his employment, to contract with them and pay them weekly according to the several rates agreed upon, and that before any account can be had of them, what their work will come to. And this is the bit I like, which, except he understands as well as themselves, he will be sure to be cheated.
That's a really great quote, and it's just interesting just thinking about the kind of obviously the range of tasks that were involved and the depth of knowledge that people you had to have about how to kind of manage the woodland effectively and how to use the kind of produce. So it's interesting how much it's not sort of like a wild wood that's left to do its own thing. It's actually been a really a sort of heavily managed, but in a way that's actually had a kind of positive impact on the diversity of the nature that's managed to flourish there. So I've got a couple more questions, but I'm also conscious there's a couple of things in the chat already. And please do add more questions, or if you want to ask in person, sort of pop your hand up and we can also take some in-person questions. Tony, can I go over to you though, and if you can pick up a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll work backwards actually, because it's more. So Joe Giddings asks, how was the timber from the wood used in construction in London?
Well, it was not on the, because it was almost exclusively coppiced, it was not used for constructional timbers on the whole. Now, Henry VIII did pass a statute ordering that for every acre of coppice wood, 12 trees must be allowed to grow to their full height in order to ensure that there was sufficient timber for his navy. Of course, he founded the Royal Naval Dockyards at Deptford, and these woods were the nearest source. What large timber came out of the woods would have gone to shipbuilding rather than house building. Quite often, houses were built from timber that had been recycled from elsewhere. I remember when they reconstructed Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank, they investigated the original, and apparently that was built out of timbers that were salvaged from ships that were being broken up. Being right by the river, that was obviously a handy source. So I don't think the woods contributed constructional timber, but of course they did, as I pointed out, provide the infill for to go in between those structural members. And in terms of wattle, they also, the charcoal they provided was used to fire bricks and tiles, and obviously to smelt iron. So they, in that respect, they contributed to the building of London.
Okay, Andrew Pat's asked a couple of questions, or he's made a comment and a question. I'll come on to the comment. He says he's actually interested in coppicing as carbon sequestration and livestock tree fodder. It's an interest that he has. And I have a question that's allied to that. In Epping Forest, we're now practicing coppicing again. I mean, is there any coppicing that's still being carried out in these woods?
Yes, certainly the London Wildlife Trust volunteers, we do a certain amount of coppicing. We don't coppice oak or hornbeam, which would have been coppiced in the past, because we think the trees have too much, the mature trees have too much value in themselves. But we do coppice hazel quite extensively, and there is a lot of hazel. We also coppice holly, and we use the coppice poles within the woods to create hurdles and so forth, basically to protect certain areas from trampling, particularly, where you've got stands of wild garlic or wood anemone. So yes, we do some coppicing on a limited scale, not on the huge scale that was done in the past, but yes, and we use the products ourselves.
That's a good point, actually. What was the kind of amount of coppice produce from some of these woods? Can you give us an idea of the scale of how much was being produced?
Well, sorry, I need to just refer to something here.
While you're doing that,
yes.
Andrew's added a comment about a coppice pole does away with the need to work it with a lathe, which I think is an interesting point, which you alluded to earlier, actually, with the furniture.
That is a very good point, yeah. Right, now, I don't know the exact volume of timber that was produced by each felling of a coppice, but I mentioned that boundary dispute between the Manor of Battersea and the Archbishop of Canterbury, or rather the Archbishop's woodman. The Archbishop himself subsequently washed his hands of the whole business. Now, Yeah. When the tenant of the Manor of Battersea was a man called Henry Ryden. He felled a coppice that must have lain on the border between Penge and Croydon. I think the Archbishop's woodman then got, I think it was 6 men with carts, horse and carts, to carry the wood away. So you're looking at sort of from the felling of one coppice, you're looking at something like 6 cartloads of wood. They deposited it in the courtyard of the Archbishop's Palace at Croydon. That was the first he claimed to have heard about it. So yeah, I mean, it produced quite a substantial amount.
Okay, I'm just going back to another. Thanks for that. I'm throwing you an awkward question. Apologies for that. But Andrew also asked another more microbiological question. So, do we have evidence of the antiquity of the woods in its microbiome? And here's a subsidiary question. Can this microbiome be propagated to seed along with any new tree plantings in areas? So it's basically a recolonization concept.
Yeah. I don't know that, I mean, we are aware of the microbiome. I'm not aware of any, actual recent scientific analysis of it. I mean, obviously our understanding of how the microbiome functions, with the hyphae of fungi and so on, is fairly recent. And I don't think anyone has done any soil analysis recently. I must admit, I am extremely skeptical about what they tend to call mitigation planting. I don't think a biome that has taken centuries to be established can be readily transferred somewhere else.
I think you might be right. Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I'll throw in one from me again. Oh, Ruth asks, are there any opportunities identified in the management plan for lost woodland to be restored?
There has been a certain amount of planting, particularly like on Streatham Common, for example. Most of the surviving fragments are rather hemmed in by roads and buildings. So the opportunity to try to recreate lost bits of woodland is limited, to put it mildly.
Can I just ask as well something that's linked to that, which is about the connectivity between the fragments? Not necessarily, perhaps I'm kind of thinking about, is there any possibility of, some animals, mammals and things being able to kind of move, even if it's through, the idea about, making gardens or other sort of bits of open space as corridors, or is it just so kind of built up that the fragments are a bit isolated from each other?
Some of them are, some of them aren't, and we are sort of, we have planted hedges, of mixed native hedgerow plants, the hawthorn, hazel, dog rose, wild cherry, and so forth. So, to try to create such corridors wherever possible. Yeah.
There's another question that's come in from Joe Giddings. How does the ecology and management of the Great Northwood compare to Epping Forest? Excuse me, sounds familiar, he says. I would agree with that as well, being an Epping Forest native myself.
Yes, well, I'm not closely familiar with Epping Forest, although I'm aware that in many ways, I think the tree species are similar, aren't they?
Yeah, actually, Robin Blades has put in an answer. Epping Forest is different in that it's largely pollarded rather than coppiced. Okay, and it's cut at a high level they don't have to exclude grazing animals, which kind of led me on to thinking in terms of pannage. And so, because you mentioned oak trees being coppiced, how did that reflect, or did that work with pannage and other activities within the woods?
Yes, it did. In fact, what they did was each coppice was fenced off for, I think, the first 7 years, so that grazing animals couldn't eat the young shoots. After that, they opened them up, and people then let their pigs in the autumn to eat the acorns.
Might be an idea if you could possibly put you on the spot again, just in case somebody doesn't know. What's the difference between pollarding and coppicing?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, coppicing takes place just above ground level. Pollarding is done basically where there are grazing animals. So it's on roadside trees and field boundary trees, and that's where the tree is cut about head height, maybe 8 feet from the ground, so the shoots are out of the reach of animals that might eat them.
I was just going to ask something about recording, because obviously you mentioned the kind of records, the earlier sort of records, and I know they're not particularly systematic, but I do love those wonderful kind of observations and descriptions you get. And then you mentioned the Lousley material that appeared in the London Naturalist. So thank you for that. What about more recent kind of survey work? Are there kind of currently systematic surveys going on, and are there particular things that are being focused on? What's the kind of more recent history of surveying?
Well, we certainly do. Throughout the spring and summer months, in Sydenham Hill Wood, we regularly do butterfly transects, about once a fortnight, walk a set route around the entire wood. The route is divided into compartments, and we basically count the number of both the number of individuals and the number of species we see. And this is quite strict and systematic. It's then submitted to that database, Green Space Information for Greater London, but it has to be done in a systematic way. You can't record anything that's behind you or more than a certain distance away. You have to walk at a steady, slowish, even speed, so that the data is comparable from one transect to another. We also have several, I think 3 or 4 bat surveys every year, which are conducted by a professional bat specialist, because you're not allowed to handle bats unless you have the necessary certificates. So she comes down from North London 3 or 4 times a year to examine the contents of our bat boxes, and that information is recorded and goes on a database. As for other things, beetles, for example, they are not done on a systematic, regular basis, but Richard Jones has, surveys the beetles every few years, and I believe his findings have also appeared in the London Naturalist. So yes, I mean, nowadays the monitoring is quite systematic and is all, centrally stored as well, so that it is accessible.
And are you finding that the sort of, obviously they're presumably most of these woods are quite heavily used by people, and they're quite heavily visited because they're kind of providing sort of green space, green access to people in quite built up areas.
Yes.
And I know one of the things that's kind of been discussed about Hampstead Heath, which obviously is even more central, that the kind of visitor numbers, it's been quite hard to sort of manage those so they're not having a negative impact on the kind of, the woodlands or, the habitats themselves. Is that a kind of an issue there, or is the balance reasonably good?
Oh, it's certainly an issue. It's something that, we have to be constantly aware of and doing our best to mitigate. I mean, on the one hand, you want the public to access these places. I mean, A, they have a right to, and B, their continued preservation depends on public appreciation of them. But yes, I mean, footfall is a serious problem, particularly around the footbridge over the disused railway line, which has been closed now for about 3 years, which has encouraged people to create desire paths where we don't really want them. I mean, we're constantly we build dead hedges along the paths to discourage people from, straying off them. What we've been able to do with a lot of the funding that has come through the Great North Wood Project is to actually really improve the paths considerably. They've now got drainage, French drains underneath them. They are slightly raised. They're cambered towards the edge, and they've got a firm gravel surface with hardcore underneath. Basically, because you can't reasonably expect people to keep to the paths if they turn into a quagmire every time it rains, which was exactly what was happening. And then people were obviously making detours around them. So I think the first thing is the provision of decent paths, and then maybe you can look at more prohibitive measures like fencing off certain areas. And I mean there is one area between the footbridge and the golf course that was very compacted, and there was absolutely no understory at all. And the oaks growing there were all of an age. They're all about 100 years old, and not necessarily in terribly good condition either. There was no new generation coming up to support them. We fenced off a very significant area of that, and already you can see the understory regenerating, which is quite encouraging. I mean, it's still got a long way to go, but you can see it's left in peace. It's starting to come back.
But that sounds, that's really encouraging. And I think it's, it's so important to have a kind of coherent management plan. And it's great that's, there's obviously been the initiative with the funding coming in to kind of get a lot of things happening. But then there's plans that are going to guide, the various kind of people that are responsible for various parts to manage in this kind of consistent, coherent way. So that sounds very positive for the kind of future. And is that something, are you quite optimistic about the kind of future of obviously it would be nice to have more of it, but what survives, is it kind of like quite a positive time, do you think?
Most of it, yes. Most of it, I think, has fairly adequate protection. Certainly Sydenham Hill Woods is actually held by the London Wildlife Trust on a lease. It's a sublease from Southwark Council, who in turn lease it from the Dulwich Estate. Relations with the Dulwich Estate were historically not terribly good because they, kind of wanted to build on the site, but they've now, after several defeats at planning stage, they've given up on those ambitions, and they're now. We now have pretty good relations with them, and in fact, they've invited the London Wildlife Trust to take over the management of their part of Dulwich Wood, which of course it adjoins Sydenham Hill Wood. Most members of the public probably don't realise that they're separate at all, although there has not been there's not been the same level of management on the Dulwich side, which hopefully there now will be.
Again, that sort of seems like that's kind of moving in the right direction as well. So that's really very positive. There's been a couple of things popped into the chat about various reports that have kind of come into the London Naturalist over the years. So there's been some work report on the birds, for example. If people want, obviously you can come and see the London Naturalist, copies of the London Naturalist at the library, but also most of them have been digitized up to the most recent ones through the Biodiversity Library. So if you go through onto our website, you'll be able to get through and actually, if you're kind of interested in following up, reading those articles, then they are kind of all available to people. So, I'm I'm kind of curious myself now to go and have a look at some of them. So I'm definitely going to follow that up. And also, obviously, to remind people, okay, it's about the loss of the nightingale. Thanks, Robin. Okay, so anyway, I was going to look anyway, even though that sounds a little bit sad. Thank you once again for a really fascinating talk, and it's certainly meant I haven't read the book yet. I'm certainly intending to go and read it, and it also makes me want to go and visit the sites and kind of, visit the sites. And actually, I've kind of been to bits of them, but I don't think I've ever really kind of got a sense about the whole and how the parts fit together. So interesting to see the new paths and things like the information boards and things like that. So it's anybody who's kind of in the area who hasn't been, I'm sure we kind of really recommend a visit or more than one visit. Do kind of buy a copy of the book if you would like to, and use that. Don't forget to use that discount. I think it's only available for a short period of time. Is it about a week or two? So if do kind of use that if you're interested in buying a copy. But certainly, I think it sounds like just will really kind of open people's eyes up to something that perhaps a lot of people don't know very much about. We've got various people have sort of said how much they've enjoyed the talk, and I'd like to thank you once again for agreeing to talk to the society. And I hope, well, I mean, maybe that's a place that we could think about visiting as the LNHS, because we obviously do lots of field meetings, and I think we've visited parts of it. So I think I think we've been to Sydenham Wood fairly recently, actually, one of the bird walks, but possibly actually thinking about looking at some of the other aspects like the entomology. I can see Tony kind of thinking about that, kind of coming along and maybe doing some work there. So thank you ever so much. Fantastic. And thank you to everybody who came along this evening. And we have recorded the talk, and it will go onto our YouTube channel in a week or two, and I'll send a message around as soon as it's available. And so people who couldn't make it, and if you want to pass it on, let other people know about it. If you've got people you think would be interested, then please do pass the details on. And just finally then, our next talk is on the 13th of July, and that will be Mark Spencer talking about basically all the plants that you will find in wetlands and the waterways of London. It's one of the habitat talks that he began a series last year. We didn't actually manage to get to this one for various reasons, so we're really delighted that he's kind of managed to make some time this year to slot that back in. So please do sign up for that. We hope to see you for that talk, and if not, for one of the other talks in the future. Thank you again for coming, and we'll see you all again hopefully very soon. Good night for now.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
We've got some nice messages in the chat, people saying thank you. Yeah, and do unmute yourself to say goodbye and thank you if you'd like to. Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Bye.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Stop recording.